Ready? Alright, so I'm refuting the claim that electric vehicles, EVs, I will say, are less environmentally friendly than advertised. And we're assuming, the way that they're usually advertised is that they have zero emissions and are, so much better for the environment and all that. And so, but my claim is that although it is true that they are not like all that, they're not all that, they don't have zero emissions and they're not like they're not so great, but they are better. And it is my claim that in the long run, EVs could have significantly less emissions than combustion vehicles and prove more environmentally friendly than combustion vehicles. And I will prove this claim, and also refute the other one, by showing that obtaining the raw material needed to power EVs is no more polluting than obtaining oil needed to power combustion vehicles. The emissions created in manufacturing are, manufacturing EVs are negligible next to the emissions created in the operating life. Those are the three main points. So I'm going to start on the first one. So although the advocate pointed out that the production of materials used to power electric vehicles damages the environment, like mining the materials in China and all that is very damaging to the environment, but I would have to point out that so is drilling oil and all that. That has a lot of harmful environmental impacts. So everyone remembers the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. That's huge ecological damage to that area. And also, there's a study by the U.S. Geological Survey that I found that outlines the environmental damage to land from petroleum scouting and drilling. And to summarize it, they said, the impact to soil, surface, and groundwater is very bad. That's basically to summarize it. And so basically, I'll move on to the second point that I'll be refuting, which is that the advocate pointed out that the production of EVs requires more energy inputs and generates greater emissions than the production of combustion vehicles. And I would have to argue that this point's kind of irrelevant, because the emissions generated during the production of a vehicle, EV or conventional, pales in comparison to the emissions generated over its operating lifetime. So it's just kind of what you really need to look at is the emissions generated over the operating lifetime. That's what really matters here. The emissions generated during the production are just so small. So finally I'll get to the third point, which is the emissions generated over the operating lifetime. So basically, the emissions generated by an EV, I'll explain this. You'd think well, they don't release gas, so how are they generating emissions? Basically, they're powering up, getting power from power stations that are burning fossil fuels and creating emissions. So really, the amount of emissions that an EV generates is left up to how the power is generated. So it's highly variable. So first of all, that's how I would sort of partially refute his claim that EVs generate more emissions, is that you can't really say that because it's just so variable. It all depends on how the power is being generated. And there's been reports, there's a report from the Union of Concerned Scientists that shows that over the life of an EV, the typical life of a vehicle lasting about 162,000 miles, a lot of times it doesn't even matter where the energy is coming from. Even if the energy's been being generated in a coal plant, a lot of times an EV will still emit less emissions than a combustion vehicle over the operating lifetime. And they went on to state that most of the reports that show EVs contributing more emissions than the combustion vehicles, those use the lifetime of the vehicle as being 50,000 miles, which is much smaller than the typical lifetime of most vehicles that people have. And also, I'd have to point to the sustainability issue, which is that for combustion vehicles, their only source of fuel is oil, which is obviously not sustainable. It has a limit. Whereas EVs can theoretically be powered by anything that creates power. So so in preparation for the future, it leaves open a lot of options. If the world decides that it's time to convert to nuclear, EVs will still work because they can get their power from any mass plant generation method. So in conclusion, EV vehicles in the consumer market are still in infancy, have a lot of potential to be a cleaner alternative to combustion vehicles.
All right, I think you've got the right idea at the beginning to say, look, EVs aren't all that, they aren't perfect, and we can acknowledge that they're not perfect, but that's not the same thing as saying that they don't have an advantage over internal combustion engines. That's the way you want to put it, much more simply. The way you went to it was, you kind of wandered into that argument. That's the argument that you're making. Be more direct in saying it. The preview I thought was a little problematic. You suggested there are 3 points that you're going to be talking about. I only heard 2 of them. They were pretty distinct. When you got to the body of the speech, I did see 3, so there's a little bit of confusion there. On the first point, I thought you had a reasonable press on the environmental damage. I think you might point out that the advocate didn't demonstrate what the significance of the environmental damage is from the mining process, how it's going to be measurable in any way. You say, in essence, that the competing sources of energy, oil, for example, for internal combustion engines, do create substantial damage, and you use primarily damage to the land, which I guess is the comparable argument to the mining issue. But your quote there is kind of a paraphrase, and it basically comes back and says, it's very bad. I don't know how I'm supposed to compare that to whatever the advocate's talking about. That's a little ambiguous. And if you have a direct quote from the USGS, it's better to do that than try to paraphrase and summarize what they said. That's going to give you a clearer argument. Your key point seems to be the issue of operating emissions, and I think that that's an important point. If the advocate's only talking about manufacturing emissions during the manufacturing process, and you're talking about emissions over the lifetime of the vehicle, and that's the important comparison to be making, I think that's a valid premise and it's an important one. I think it needs to be demonstrated a little bit more. You say it's the key factor. It certainly sounds like the key factor. But I don't have any numbers. So over the lifetime of a vehicle, how much emissions are produced by the average car, for instance, compared to over the life of the vehicle, including manufacturing, or produced by an EV. I don't get any data on that. So I think your point is valid. I think there's probably truth there, but I don't have the information that would back up that point. It's way too ambiguous. And then on your third point, I thought that you had a very good argument here that says that assumes that the only energy sources for electricity are going to be fossil fuels, and you point out that there are in fact other alternatives that might be, the whole idea that it's variable. I think that's a good argument to make. And you could demonstrate how variable it is by pointing out, well, what percentage of our electricity currently is produced by nuclear power? What percentage is produced by wind or solar power? Is there a belief that those are going to be expanding in the future? If you had a couple of arguments like that, then I think that would strengthen the point that you're making there. You've got the right press there. You've got the right argument. You just need to have a little bit of follow through on those points. All right. Thank you.